When I was rushed into surgery, nobody from family came to the hospital. They all went to celebrate my cousin's birthday instead. But as I woke up in recovery, my phone lit up with a message from my mom, "We need to talk urgently," followed by 89 missed calls. My name is Adrian, I'm 27. And if you had asked me a year ago, I would have said my family wasn't perfect. They were at least dependable, the kind of family that might argue over holidays or whisper little criticisms behind your back, but when something truly serious happened they'd show up. I believed that until the night I was rushed into surgery and realized how wrong I was. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I've been feeling off for a while, no stomach pains that I brushed off, his stress, or maybe bad takeout. I worked long hours, didn't always sleep enough, and figure my body was just reminding me I wasn't invincible. That night, though, pain hit like a truck. It doubled me over in my tiny apartment kitchen, sharp enough that I couldn't even stand. I called for an ambulance, more panicked than I've ever been in my life, clutching my stomach while I tried to remember to breathe. The last thing I thought before the MTS loaded me into the back was, at least mom and dad will come, at least I won't be alone. Surgery was an optional. The doctors explained something about an obstruction and internal bleeding, words that blurred together under the haze of morphine. I was terrified. I held on to the idea that my family would be waiting for me when I came out, my parents, my sister, maybe even a cousin or two. They drop everything. Who wouldn't, right? When your kid, your sibling, your blood is rushed into surgery, you go, except they didn't. When I woke up hours later in the recovery room, groggy and dry mouth, first thing I reached for was my phone. Not a single missed call before surgery, not a single text asking if I was okay. My chest tightened, not from the stitches but from this heavy sinking realization. I scrolled again, half convinced I was too drugged to see properly. Nothing, just silence. It wasn't until the next morning that the flood began. My phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls, mostly from my mom, and one long text that simply read, "We need to talk urgently, urgently." As if she'd been wringing her hands all night, worried, sick. But where had she been when I was on that operating table? Or had anyone been pieced it together slowly through social media while I was under anesthesia? My entire family, parents, sister, aunts, uncles, even my grandparents, had been at my cousin Damien's birthday party. There were photos of them laughing around a cake, drinks in hand, balloons everywhere. My dad had his arm around Damien in one of them, holding up a glass, like he was the proudest man alive. My mom had even commented on one of the pictures, "Family first, always family first." The words hit me like ice water. I remember lying there in the hospital, bed stitches, pulling with every movement, staring at those photos, my 4 beeped softly beside me. I wasn't crying, not exactly. It was something worse, a kind of numbness that settled in my chest like a door closing. They hadn't even checked in until after the party was over, and even then it wasn't concerned. That filled their messages. It was guilt, poorly disguised as urgency. The nurse came in around noon with a small smile, asking if anyone was coming to see me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My family hadn't shown not one. She gave me this gentle look like she understood more than I said, told me not to worry, that some people just didn't know how to handle emergencies. But I knew better. They hadn't come because they chose not to. They had decided Damien, his birthday, was more important than me being cut open on a table. That was the first time I let myself replay all the little things I brushed off for years. The time my parents left me stranded after prom because my sister wanted to go to a party instead. The way my achievements, graduating, getting my first job, were always overshadowed by Damien's endless accomplishments. How my mom once told me flat out, "You'll never shine the way he does, but that's okay, you don't need to." I'd swallow that down, telling myself I was overthinking that. I just needed to toughen up. But now, lying in that hospital bed, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I wasn't a priority to them. I never had been. And yet that flood of missed calls and messages kept coming. By the time I was strong enough to sit up, my phone was full of desperate little. "Please call us back, Adrian. This isn't how family works. Don't be dramatic. We love you." The audacity of it made my hands shake. They hadn't come when it mattered, they hadn't even sent flowers, but now they wanted to talk urgently, as if I owed them something. That was the moment the anger started to bloom hot and steady under the numbness. I didn't know it then. But that anger would carry me through the weeks that followed. It would sharpen into something colder, more deliberate, because if they thought they could abandon me in my most vulnerable moment and then sweep it under the rug with a few frantic messages, they were sorely mistaken. The funny thing, they had no idea what was coming. I didn't respond to any of their messages. For the first few days I lay in that sterile hospital room eating bland soup and jello, scrolling through their social media updates. While I sat with stitches running across my abdomen, struggling to walk to the bathroom without wincing, my parents were posting photos of the best family night ever with Damien and his friends. My sister even wrote a caption under one picture. "We always show up for each other. That's what family means." I nearly dropped my phone when I read it, show up for each other. I was in the hospital bed, stitched up like a broken toy, and apparently I didn't count. The hospital discharged me a week later. No one came to pick me up. The nurse wheeled me to the entrance where I awkwardly climbed into an Uber, clutching my bag against the tug of stitches. As we pulled out of the hospital, I wondered if maybe I'd walk into my apartment and find flowers on the counter or food left in the fridge. There was nothing, no note, no gesture, just the same silence that had followed me all week. 2 days after I got home, Mom finally showed up unannounced. I heard the key twist in the lock. She still had a spare from when I moved in years ago. The door swung open and there she was holding a grocery bag of fruit, as if that erased everything. She looked me up and down, her eyes darting to the healing line under my shirt. "Adrian," she said with this sigh that sounded more inconvenienced than concerned. "You should have told us how serious it was. Thought it was something minor. Do you know how guilty we all feel?" I stared at her. "I was rushed into emergency surgery. How much more serious could it be?" She waved her hand like I was exaggerating. "Honey, we had already promised Amy and we'd be there for his birthday. How important that was to him. We didn't want him to feel abandoned on his big day." That word abandoned made my jaw tighten. I wanted to laugh. Pain in my stomach wouldn't let me so. "You abandoned me." Instead, she frowned, setting the fruit on the counter as if to change the subject. "You're being harsh. We've always done our best for you, but, Damien, he needs us. How fragile he is. You're strong, you can handle things on your own." Strong, that word had always been there. Excuse. When my sister needed tuition help, they scrambled to cover it, calling her delicate. When Damien crashed his car last year, they rallied around him saying he was going through a tough time. But me, I was always strong, which really meant we don't have to try. I didn't say much after that, I just nodded, let her ramble about how much family unity mattered, and then watched her leave like nothing had happened. A few days later, the calls started again. This time it was my dad. His tone was less apologetic, more commanding. "Adrian, you need to stop making this into a big deal. Everyone is upset you're ignoring them. Damien especially thinks you're holding a grudge over nothing. He said he tried to call you the night of the surgery, but you didn't pick up." I gripped the phone tighter. "I was under anesthesia, Dad," he chuckled like I'd made a joke. "Still, you could have tested before going in, just to let everyone know it was life or death. Otherwise, how are we supposed to know?" That was the moment I realized this wasn't guilt, it was damage control. They weren't sorry for missing my surgery. They were sorry I wasn't playing along with the story they wanted to tell. The next family gathering drove that home. They insisted I come, saying it would heal the rift. Against my better judgment, I went. I wanted to see if maybe acknowledge what happened. But the second I walked in, Damien was front and center bragging about how everyone came together for his birthday. "Best night of my life," he said, clapping my dad on the shoulder. "Family always has my back." I stood there quiet while my mom passed me a plate, like I was a guest instead of her son. Nobody asked about my recovery. Nobody mentioned the hospital. Instead, my aunt leaned over and whispered, "Don't sulk, Adrian. It was just bad timing. Damien's party was planned months in advance." I swallowed every bitter word I wanted to say and sat there, nodding politely like I hadn't almost died, alone while they ate cake. But inside something was shifting. The anger that had started in that hospital bed was hardening into something else. A determination called clarity. If they couldn't see what they'd done, they really thought I was just going to forget it. Then they had no idea who I really was. Sooner or later they were going to find out 2 weeks after that family gathering. I thought maybe I could start to put some distance between myself and the whole ordeal. My stitches were healing, I was able to walk around without wincing too much, and I was finally back at work part-time. I figured if I kept my head down and focused on myself the storm would pass. But then came the betrayal that made everything crystal clear. There was no moving on, not with them. It started on a Wednesday evening. I had just gotten home from work, still in my uniform, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It wasn't a call or a text, it was a bank alert, unusual activity detected. My stomach dropped. I opened the app and, sure enough, over $4,000 had been withdrawn in a single day. Plane tickets, hotel reservations, luxury restaurant charges, all booked under Damien's name. At first I thought it had to be fraud. No one in their right mind would use my card without asking, right? I remembered my mom still had my spare card, the one I'd given her years ago when I moved out case of emergencies. I'd never asked for it back because I figured she'd never use it without telling me. My chest tightened as the reality sank in. They had gone into my account without permission while I was still recovering. Called Mom immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice casual, like nothing was wrong. Good, you're finally calling us back. I was starting to think you'd cut us off completely. Why is Damien using my card? I asked, my voice flat. There was a pause and a dismissive laugh. Adrian, don't make such a fuss. Damien had an opportunity to travel with some friends and his account was overdrawn. We thought you wouldn't mind helping out for family. You've always been so independent. My grip on the phone tightened. Being out $4,000 is not helping out. You stole from me, she gasped. I had insulted her. Don't say it like that. We were going to tell you. Eventually you make enough to spare and Damien really needed this. It's his last chance to go on this kind of trip before he settles down. You wouldn't understand. My throat went dry. I was in the hospital a week ago alone and you thought it was fine to drain my account so Damien could party. Her voice hardened its sharp tone. I remembered from childhood when she wanted me to feel ashamed. Adrian, don't twist this. You should be grateful. We trust you enough to contribute when the family needs it. Damien has always been there for us. It's time you learn to do the same. I hung up before I could say something. I'd regret my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The betrayal didn't stop there. That weekend I got another notification. My father had transferred money from the joint emergency account we'd set up years ago. Just in case something happened to them, Ian, my mom had promised never to touch it without consulting me, and yet half of it was gone. When I confronted him, he brushed it off with the same line, family first, you're strong enough to rebuild. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. They had left me to face surgery alone, then turned around and treated me like a walking wallet, as if my survival had no value, except for what I could provide to Damien as comfort. Final straw came at Sunday dinner. I hadn't planned to go, but my sister tested that it's time you stop sulking against my better judgment. I went telling myself I'd get answers face to face. The table was loud with chatter. When I walked in, Damien sat at the head, grinning as he scrolled through photos from his trip, photos that my money had paid for. He waved his phone around showing off fancy meals, a yacht, laughing friends. Man. This was the best week of my life. Couldn't have done it without family. He looked straight at me when he said it. Everyone clapped and cheered like he had achieved something incredible. My mother even added, see, Adrian, this is what family sacrifice is about. We all help each other. I stared at them, my fork frozen in my hand. Not one word about my surgery, not one word about the fact that they had stolen from me. Just applause for Damien, who had turned my money into his victory lap. That was the moment something inside me broke. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was clarity. They weren't going to change. They had chosen their golden boy. I was nothing but a convenient afterthought, someone to use when it suited them. I smiled tightly through dinner, nodding at their empty words, but inside I made a promise to myself. They thought I was going to keep playing this role, the strong one, the disposable one. They were in for a surprise, and that was the night I began quietly planning. After that dinner, I left my parents' house with a hollow feeling in my chest. I remember the sound of their laughter echoing behind me as I closed the door, a sound that used to feel comforting but now felt like knives pressed against my ribs. It was the sound of a family united, but not with me, against me. The Uber ride back to my apartment was silent, except for the dole of the engine. I stared out the window at the blur of street lights, my reflection faint in the glass. I barely recognized myself. My body still hurt every time I moved too quickly and my finances, already stretched thin from medical bills, had been gutted by my own family. Worse than the physical pain or the money, though the loneliness. I had always believed deep down that, even if they didn't understand me, my parents loved me. That belief had been the last thread tying me to them and it had finally snapped. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. My body healed slowly, but emotionally I was crumbling. At work I kept my head down forcing a smile for customers, while my inside screamed. At home, I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, replaying every betrayal, my father's chuckle on the phone when I confronted him about the stolen money. Damien's smug grin as he bragged about his trip. My mother's sharp tone when she scolded me for being ungrateful. I realized I hadn't just been abandoned during my surgery. They had abandoned me long before that. I just wanted to see it. Bills started piling up faster than I could keep up. My savings, which had taken years to build, were drained. When the credit card statements rolled in, I felt sick. The charges weren't mine, but legally the debt was. I contacted the bank, explained what had happened, even filed a fraud claim. The investigation was slow, and in the meantime collectors wanted their money. I had to pick up extra shifts just to stay afloat. All my body screamed at me for pushing too hard too soon. After surgery there was one night that sticks out in particular. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment because I couldn't afford a proper couch. Yet most of my savings had gone into trying to build a future one step at a time. I was eating instant noodles. My stitch is aching. When my phone buzzed, it was Damien photo, him in front of a casino holding a stack of chips. Captioned "Living the Dream." My money, my sacrifices, his dream. I didn't reply. I just set the phone down and stared at the noodles until they went cold. That was my rock bottom, the realization that no matter how much I gave, they would keep taking until there was nothing left. And yet, in that pit of despair, something small began to stir a seed of resolve. They thought I was weak if they thought I was too strong to need help, but not strong enough to fight back. They were wrong. I started to think about the details. They never paid attention to Bear Key. My mom still had the accounts. My dad thought I didn't know about the little secrets Damien bragged about when he'd had too much to drink. I started writing things down, piecing together patterns, keeping receipts literal and figurative. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to keep being their scapegoat, their wallet, or their forgotten son. I was going to bide my time, gather my strength, and when the moment came, I would make them see me not as the strong one they could lean on, but as someone they never should have underestimated. And so I smiled through my pain, nodded through their guilt. Written texts played the part they expected, but inside, in the quiet, I was already walking away from them, step by step. The shift didn't happen overnight. At first it was small, almost invisible. I started by reclaiming what was mine, called the bank, again, this time refusing to back down when they gave me the same scripted responses about processing times. I asked to speak to supervisors, filed complaints, and sent every piece of documentation I had. I kept a binder filled with evidence, statements, screenshots of Damien's posts, records of the withdrawals. I learned quickly that persistence was its own kind of weapon, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a sliver of control at work. Things began to change too. My manager noticed how I handled the extra shifts without complaint, even when I was clearly tired. Instead of pity, she offered me an opportunity, training for a supervisory role. The raise was a massive, but it was enough to remind me that I didn't have to depend on anyone else. Each paycheck that went directly toward repairing the damage felt like another stone laid in the foundation of my independence. Slowly, financial hole began to close. I cut out everything unnecessary, lived simply, and poured every spare dollar into rebuilding. It was grueling, but it was also freeing. I realized that I needed from my family the less power they had over me. Every time I watched the balance in my account grow, I felt a sense of strength they could never take. And, beyond money, something deeper was shifting. My phone would buzz with their calls, their guilt-laced messages, but I stopped responding. The silence gave me room to breathe. In that quiet I rediscovered parts of myself I hadn't paid attention to in years. I started running in the mornings, just short distances at first, then longer as my body healed. I read books I'd always put off. I joined a small local group for young professionals, something I would have ever been too nervous to try before, and found myself surrounded by people who actually listened when I spoke. The more I invested in myself, the more their absence stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like relief. I no longer had to brace myself for their manipulations, their favoritism, or the endless comparisons to Damien. I wasn't the strong one anymore. I was simply myself, and that was enough. Then an opportunity came that changed everything. A colleague introduced me to someone starting a new business venture, and they needed someone organized, persistent, and detail-oriented to help manage operations. I hesitated at first. I was still calling my way out of debt, but something inside told me to take the leap. I did. It was hard work, that left me exhausted but fulfilled. For the first time, my efforts weren't being overshadowed by someone else's needs or dismissed. As expected, I was recognized, valued. Within 6 months the venture was turning a profit. I was holding equity in something that had real potential. My name was on the paperwork, my contributions were acknowledged. The financial stability I'd lost was returning faster than I dared to hope. Meanwhile, my family still thought I was barely scraping by. The few times I ran into them, they made snide comments about me working too much or living small. Damien, especially, would smirk and say things like, "Not everyone is cut out for the big life, cousin." I smiled, nodded, and let him believe it, because the less they knew, the more power I had. By the end of that year I was stronger financially, emotionally and mentally I had ever been. I had carved out a life without them, one brick at a time, and with every step forward felt the weight of their betrayal lifting. But here's the thing, just because I was moving on didn't mean I'd forgotten. No, the anger that had burned in me that night at dinner had never gone out. It had simply transformed from raw pain into something sharper, steadier patience. And when the moment came, and I knew it would, I'd be ready. It was almost eerie how naturally the pieces started falling into place, like fate was nudging me towards something I hadn't dared to envision before. By the time a year had passed since my surgery, my life looked nothing like the hollow, desperate months that followed my discharge. I was thriving, still modest by most standards. For me, it felt like climbing out of a pit and standing on solid ground for the first time. And that's when the information, the leverage I hadn't even been searching for, began to reveal itself. It started with Damien. He'd always been the loud one, the showboat, bragging about deals he had in the works, money he didn't actually have. Women he thought adored him and a mutual acquaintances get together. Someone from high school I hadn't seen in years, Damien. His name came up. Apparently he had been boasting about a startup investment he was running, promising insane returns if people bought in. My acquaintance rolled his eyes and muttered, basically a pyramid scheme. Half the guys who gave him money are already asking questions. I didn't react, just listened, nodding casually, but inside my mind was racing. If Damien was scanning people, it wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was dangerous. If it came crashing down, which it would, my family's blind support for him would turn into their biggest liability. The second piece of leverage came from my father. I was digging through some old files one evening organizing my documents now that I was taking better care of my finances, when I stumbled across paperwork from the emergency fund account he had raided. Buried in the fine print was a detail I hadn't noticed before. My name wasn't just on the account. I had full legal rights to review, draw and audit it. And as I started going over the statements, I saw patterns. Money moved around, withdrawn in automats, sometimes deposited into what looked like my parents' personal ventures. That night I realized something crucial. They weren't just careless with my trust, they were careless with their own paper trail. If I wanted to, I could map out exactly where every dollar had gone. And, more importantly, when final peace came, oddly enough for my mother, she called one afternoon, the kind of call I almost ignored out of habit. But curiosity got the better of me and I picked up. Tone was sugar sweet beneath it. I caught the strain. Adrian, dear, you should come to the reunion this year. Everyone will be there, Damien especially. He wants to share his success with the whole family. You wouldn't want to miss it, would you? I asked why she was pushing so hard and that's when she slept. It's important people see as united. There are rumors, some people don't understand Damien business and we don't want anyone thinking less of our family. There it was fear, not of me, not of what they'd done, but of appearances, of reputation. For years I had been the expendable one, the scapegoat, but now, unknowingly, they were handing me the greatest advantage I could have asked for, their desperation to keep up the image of perfection. I hung up that call with a calmness I hadn't felt in months. My body no longer ached from surgery, my finances were stable, my position in the new business venture was growing stronger by the day, and now I had three undeniable truths: Damien is fraud, my father's sloppy financial trail and my mother's obsession with appearances. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They had built their lives on a foundation of favoritism, manipulation, and lies. All it would take was the right push at the right time to send the whole thing crumbling down. And I, quiet, overlooked, underestimated me, was standing in the perfect position to give that push. The night of the family reunion, I arrived later than usual, not late enough to seem disrespectful, but late enough to ensure every eye in the room turned when I walked through the doors. The event was held at a rented banquet hall, polished floors reflecting golden chandeliers, a small stage at the front where speeches were already underway. My mother had insisted on this year's gathering being special. I knew why. She wanted to bury the whispers, the doubts creeping through the extended family about Damien's ventures. The moment I walked in I caught sight of him. Damien stood at the center of the crowd, a glass in one hand and his other arm wrapped around my father's shoulder. His suit looked too expensive for someone who had always lived off the kindness-pity of others. He was grinning, wide teeth gleaming under the lights as he boasted about his expanding enterprise, and with family always behind me, he said, raising his glass, success is inevitable. Crowd applauded. My parents glowed with pride. My sister rolled her eyes. Even she smiled, like she was proud to be connected to him. I stood at the back for a moment, letting the scene settle in my chest. The same people who had left me to lie alone in a hospital bed were now applauding the man who had stolen from me and others, convinced he was the crown jewel of the family. I didn't rush. Revenge, after all, is sweetest when savored. I waited until after dinner, when the room was buzzing with chatter, before I approached my mother. She looked startled to see me, then quickly masked it with a smile. "Adrian darling, so glad you came. See, we're all together again, isn't this wonderful?" I repeated softly, my gaze drifting to Damien. "Mind, if I say a few words," her face tightened. "Maybe later," dear Damien prepared something, but I was already walking toward the stage. Conversations quieted. As I climbed the steps, Damien's smug grin faltered for the first time. Suspicion flickering in his eyes, took the microphone, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make people shift in their seats. "I won't take much of your time," I began, voice steady. "I just wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight. Family gatherings are important. They remind us who we can depend on when life takes unexpected turns." A few polite nods, my mother clasped her hands together tightly. "Some of you might know," continued, "that not too long ago I had to undergo emergency surgery. It was life-threatening, and while I lay in a hospital bed covering, this family paused scanning the room, chose to celebrate Damien's birthday. Instead, not one of them came to see me." A ripple went through the crowd. I saw my aunt stiffen, my grandmother frown, my mother's smile froze in place. "But that's not I said, quickly raising a hand before anyone could interrupt. "The point is that sometimes the ones you expect to stand by you don't. Sometimes the ones you least expect are the ones who see the truth, like the people Damien has been doing business with." The room shifted uneasily, Damien's eyes narrowed. "Adrian, don't," he muttered under his breath. But the microphone caught it. I smiled, calm, patient. "See, I've been keeping records." While my family was too busy applauding Damien's supposed success, I discovered where some of that money really came from: bank transfers, withdrawals from accounts that weren't his, even my own card used without permission. And then there are the investors, people in this very community who handed Damien their trust and their savings, only to be met with lies, gasps, murmurs. My father stepped forward, his face red. "That's enough, Adrian. This is not the place." "On the contrary," I said, my voice sharp but calm. "This is exactly the place, because this family prides itself on appearances, on pretending we're united. But unity built on fraud and favoritism isn't family con." The room erupted in whispers. Damien, his mask cracked, his grin gone, placed by a snarl. "You think you can ruin me with your little stories?" I pulled out the folder I brought, thick with printed statements, screenshots, and documents. I placed it on the table in front of me. "Not stories proof enough to end your scheme before it destroys anyone else. And don't worry, I've already made copies. This isn't going away." My mother rushed forward then, her voice trembling. "Adrian, please, let's not do this here. We can talk privately." The whispers had turned into voices, accusations already being thrown Damien's way. One of the men at the table stood up, his face pale. "You told me my money was safe. I gave you everything." Another followed, shouting, "Is this true?" The room descended into chaos and I stepped down from the stage, my heart hammering but my face serene. My mother reached for me as I passed, but I pulled away. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being overlooked. They all saw me now, not as the expendable son, but as the one who shattered their illusion and as Damien floundered in the storm of his own making. I walked calmly to the exit, the noise of their outrage fading behind me. That was only the beginning, because revenge isn't just about exposing the truth. It's about making sure they feel the weight of what they did every single day. Afterward, the aftermath unfolded quicker than I could have imagined. Within a week of the reunion, Damien's entire scheme collapsed. The investors I'd quietly contacted beforehand, neighbors, cousins, even a family friend who had been pouring savings into his startup, filed formal complaints. By the end of the month, authorities were involved. Damien was dragged into hearings, squirming under questions. He couldn't talk his way out of his grin. That ever-present shield of arrogance was gone. In its place was a pale, desperate man trying to salvage scraps from a crumbling empire. My father, once so proud of Damien, tried to shield him. At first he insisted to anyone who would listen that Damien had been misunderstood, that I had twisted the truth. Then investigators found traces of my father's own involvement. Money shifted from the emergency account into Damien Ventures. Paper trail was undeniable. Suddenly, Dad was no longer the stern patriarch but a man cornered by his own negligence. His reputation in the community, once solid and respected, began to fracture. My mother, perhaps the most tragic figure in all of it, clung to denial. She called me in the days following, her voice shaking, begging me to take it back, as if truth was something I could erase with a simple apology. "You've humiliated us, Adrian," she whispered once, her voice raw. Do you know what people are saying about our family? I wanted to tell her what I had screamed inside that hospital bed a year ago alone. Where were you when I needed you? But I didn't. I only said now what it feels like words spread beyond family, Damien. His name became poison in our town. The same relatives who once praised him now avoided him entirely. Friends who had toasted him at his birthday wouldn't answer his calls. He'd lost everything, his investors, his reputation, even the hollow sense of superiority. He built his life around. As for my parents, their social circle shrank overnight. Invitations dried up, people whispered about the golden family that had covered for a fraud. For the first time, they couldn't hide behind appearances, and every time they looked at me, they saw the one who had pulled the curtain down in me. My life moved forward. The business venture I had invested in continued to grow steadily, and surely I no longer lived in fear of the next betrayal or the next blow to my bank account. My days were full work. I cared about friends who valued me, peace I hadn't thought possible. The last time I saw Damien was in court. He spotted me across the room. His eyes bloodshot, his face scarred. For a moment. He looked at me the way he used to, like I was the weaker cousin, the one to be pitied or mocked. Then his gaze flickered to the folder in my hands, the records, the proof that all had unraveled his empire, and he dropped his eyes, couldn't hold my stare. That was the moment I knew it was finished, because revenge isn't loud, it isn't a scream or a fight. Sometimes it's simply standing tall when those who hurt you are brought low by their own choices. Sometimes it's walking away with your head high, knowing the people who once underestimated, you will never forget what you did. As I stepped out of that courthouse into the cool air, I finally felt the weight lift. They had left me to face death alone, but I had come back stronger than they could ever imagine. They wanted me invisible. Instead, I became unforgettable.